It was late. One of those nights where the parking lot lights feel too bright and everything else feels muted. I was sitting in my car, engine still warm, phone in my hand, staring at a receipt I hadn't planned on generating. Nothing dramatic. $20-something. The kind of charge that barely registers. What stuck with me wasn't what I bought, but why I bought it. I realized I hadn't wanted to explain myself to anyone, including me. I didn't want to talk about being tired or why I didn't feel like cooking or why I needed things to just be easy for a minute. Paying felt cleaner than talking. At the time, it felt practical, responsible even, just handling it. But sitting there, I had this quiet sense that money had stepped in to replace something else. And I remember thinking how often that trade probably happened without me noticing it at all. I started replaying other moments like that. Group dinners where I ordered more than I wanted because I didn't feel like explaining why I was keeping it light. Extra rounds, shared tabs, add-ons that weren't really about enjoyment. They were about avoiding the small pause where someone might ask a question. It always felt minor. $30 here, $40 there, not worth the friction. I told myself it was just part of having a social life, part of being easygoing. But the feeling underneath was familiar. A kind of quiet impatience with myself. I didn't want to justify my energy level, my budget, or my mood. Paying was faster. What I didn't notice at the time was how often that choice showed up week after week. It never felt reckless, it felt smooth. And that's what made it hard to look at honestly when I finally slowed down enough to notice it. Delivery was the next thing I noticed. Not the food itself, but the fees. The way 10 or 12 extra dollars slid in quietly because I didn't feel like explaining why I wasn't up for going out or cooking or even deciding. 3 deliveries a week didn't feel like a habit. It felt like survival. But one night I did the math without meaning to. About $40 a week in fees alone. That's roughly $160 a month. Close to $2,000 a year. Just to avoid saying, I'm wiped. That number didn't feel shocking. It felt uncomfortable in a quieter way. Like realizing you've been leaning on something longer than you thought. I didn't feel lazy. I felt worn down, and money kept offering itself as the fastest way to keep that feeling from turning into a conversation. Upgrades showed up the same way. Faster shipping, better seats, premium versions of things I barely cared about. It was rarely about comfort. It was about not wanting to be the person who slows things down. An extra 20 here, 30 there. I told myself it wasn't worth thinking about. But those moments almost always happened around other people. Clicking the nicer option so there wouldn't be a pause, a question, a look. When I finally noticed that pattern, it felt a little embarrassing. Not because of the money, but because of the reason. Over a year, those upgrades added up to a few $100s without ever feeling like a decision. I wasn't choosing more, I was choosing quiet. And that realization didn't feel clever. It felt personal in a way I hadn't expected. Subscriptions were another place where explanation got expensive. I kept paying for things I barely used because canceling felt like admitting something had changed. $10 here, $15 there. None of it felt irresponsible. It felt nostalgic. When I added them up, it came out to around $40 a month, almost $500 a year. Not huge, but not nothing either. What bothered me wasn't the total. It was the fact that those charges were tied to versions of myself I wasn't really living anymore. I didn't cancel because that would have meant acknowledging it. So I paid instead, quietly, month after month. It wasn't about access. It was about avoiding a small, uncomfortable truth that money was more than willing to cover up for me. Gas station stops were sneakier. Grabbing something because standing there empty-handed felt awkward. $5, $8, a drink I didn't want, a snack I didn't need. It felt social, almost automatic. When I finally looked back at a month's worth of those charges, it was over $100, more than $1,400 a year. That number landed heavier than I expected. Not because it broke the bank, but because I couldn't remember a single one of those purchases clearly. They were all made to avoid a moment of nothing, a moment where I didn't have a reason. Money filled that space every time, and I realized how often I paid just to stay in rhythm with the moment, even when I didn't care about the outcome at all. Credit cards blurred it all together, picking up the tab, rounding up, covering something so no one had to think about it. I liked seeing myself as generous, easygoing. What I didn't like looking at was how often generosity showed up when I didn't feel like talking. A few extra $100 a month didn't feel dramatic, but over a year, it was thousands. And the balance wasn't coming from big splurges. It came from small silences I paid for over and over again. When I noticed that, it felt uncomfortable in a way that didn't go away quickly, like realizing a habit you thought was harmless had been quietly steering things for a long time without asking. Clothes were similar. Buying slightly nicer things than I needed so I wouldn't have to explain why I didn't care. A $90 shirt instead of a $40 one. Not because it mattered to me, but because it made things easier. My closet filled up with stuff I felt neutral about. That neutrality bothered me more than regret would have. Over time, those upgrades added up to hundreds of dollars a year. I wasn't excited about what I bought. I wasn't unhappy either. I was just matching a room I never asked to be in. And money kept helping me do that without making a sound. Convenience fees felt invisible at first. Parking apps, service charges, express options that shaved off a minute or two. Individually, they felt insignificant. Together, they added up to nearly $90 in 1 month, over $1,000 a year. When I saw that number, it didn't feel like I'd been careless. It felt like I'd been tired. Those fees showed up whenever I didn't want to slow down or question something. Money stepped in to keep things moving, and I realized this was the part I hadn't wanted to look at first. Not the purchases themselves, but how often exhaustion made the decision for me. Price increases slid by the same way. A streaming service goes up $5. A gym fee creeps higher. I'd shrug and say it was fine. Over a year, those little increases turned into a few $100s. It wasn't one moment, it was a slow acceptance. I didn't feel angry. I felt resigned, and that feeling cost more than I thought. Looking back, it feels strange how often I chose not to ask why something changed, just because asking felt heavier than paying. Eating out became less about hunger and more about avoiding explanation. I didn't want to explain why I was saving, or tired, or just not into it. So I went along. $25 here, $30 there, 3 times a week, close to $4,000 a year. That number sat with me longer than most. Not because it was shocking, but because it felt familiar. Those meals weren't memorable. They were filler, a way to keep things smooth. And realizing how much that smoothness cost made the whole thing feel heavier than I expected, rideshares replaced walking more often than I'd admit. $10 instead of $0 because I didn't want to explain why I was okay waiting or taking my time. It felt small, but it happened a lot, about $200 a month, $2,400 a year. When I saw that, it felt like paying rent on impatience, not urgency, just a low tolerance for friction. Money stepped in whenever I didn't want to justify moving slower than the moment expected. Tech upgrades followed the same pattern: new phone, new device. Not because the old one was broken, but because explaining why I was keeping it felt awkward. $1,000 every couple of years doesn't feel constant, but spread out, it's still a few $100s a year. What bothered me wasn't the tech. It was realizing how often spending replaced a simple statement I never made. I didn't say I was fine with what I had. I just paid to avoid saying anything at all. Late fees showed up when avoidance won. $35, $40. I told myself it was a mistake, but it happened more than once. Over a year, it was around $300. Not devastating, just annoying. And that annoyance felt familiar, like paying interest on stress I didn't want to face. Money absorbed it quietly and I let it. Memberships stayed active longer than they should have. Gym, classes, things tied to versions of me I wasn't really living anymore. Canceling felt like admitting that. $60 a month doesn't feel huge. $720 a year feels different. That money wasn't buying access, it was buying delay, a way to postpone acknowledging change. Splitting things evenly came up more than I realized. Dinners, trips, shared costs that didn't really match my situation. Fairness felt easier than explanation. Over time, that added up to hundreds, maybe thousands. I didn't feel wronged by anyone else. I felt quietly out of alignment with myself. And money smoothed that over just enough for me to ignore it for a while. Travel made it clearer. Better hotels. Pricier flights. Not because I needed them, but because I didn't want to explain limits. One trip didn't matter. A year's worth did. When I looked at the total, it felt heavy. Not regretful, just honest. Silence turned out to be expensive when it followed me out of town, too. Speed became something I paid for more than I realized. Priority options, express lines, anything that promised less waiting. But the time saved didn't always make me feel better. Sometimes it just moved the stress around. Looking back, it's clear how often money stepped in where patience used to be, and how little I questioned that exchange while it was happening. One night I added it all up. The deliveries, the fees, the upgrades, the quiet yeses. It came out to over $600 a month, more than $7,000 a year. That number didn't feel dramatic. It felt sobering, like spotting a leak you've been stepping around for a long time. None of it felt wrong in the moment. That's what made it hard to see. Now, when I think about those choices, I picture late nights, small receipts, and moments I didn't want to explain myself. Money didn't disappear. It drifted. It filled gaps where words might have gone. And even now, I still feel that pull sometimes. That urge to let money handle it, just to keep things simple. I don't always stop it. I just notice it sooner. And sometimes that's enough to make the moment linger a little longer than it used to.